Hello. For tonight's Grizzly Tale, I'm going to read you a story from Grizzly Tales for Gruesome Kids. These are cautionary tales that I wrote for lovers of squeam. Tonight's story is called The Spaghetti Man. There is a shop in Venice that never opens. The white paint which used to dazzle passers-by when the sun came out is peeling off the walls. The blue gates that lead into the backyard are firmly bolted. Nobody knows what has become of Mr. Fettuccini, the man who used to run this pasta factory, and yet the place is not deserted. Once a year, in the absolute deadest part of night, the great silver pasta machines can be heard as they grind into action. The following morning, the blue gates creak open, a gleaming black van drives out, and the pasta factory falls silent for another year. In the kitchen, Mrs. King was having the usual problem. "I hate it, yuck!" "But you liked it yesterday, Timothy," said Mrs. King. "I did not," said Timothy rudely. "I've never liked it ever since before the day I was born." "George," pleaded Mrs. King, "do something." Mr. King put down his paper and looked at Timothy. He had never been very good at telling his son off. "Timothy," he said, "this is very bad form, you know, old boy. Word to the wise, do as the Memsahib says, or you'll find yourself doing a stretch in the cooler." Timothy never understood what his father was talking about. It didn't sound like a telling off, so he started screaming again. "I hate your cooking! Your food smells disgusting! It makes me want to be sick!" Mrs. King left the kitchen in tears. Mr. King left the kitchen for work. And Timothy left the kitchen in a mess. Timothy was a rude little boy. Even his friends said so, and none of them were saints. He was nice enough when he was playing or having a bath, but come meal times he turned into a hideous, squealing, moaning monster who spat his food over the walls and hurled abuse at his poor mother. He was, in short, revolting. A spoilt brat who needed to be taught a lesson. It was a Sunday when Timothy got his first visit. Mrs. King had spent the whole morning in the kitchen preparing a Sunday roast. Timothy had been out with his father to watch a polo match in Richmond Park, and he was bored silly. "I don't want that muck," he said. "Give me fish fingers, chips and peas." "Hold fire, lad, hold fire," whispered Mr. King. But Timothy was in no mood to hold fire. He shut his eyes tight and held his breath. "Your food won't go away just because you've closed your eyes, Timothy," said his mother. "Well, then I shall make it go away," said Timothy. And he picked up his plate and threw it at the sink. The food hit the window with a splat and slid down the glass into the goldfish bowl. Timothy heard the latch click on the front door. "Who's that?" said Mr. King. There was no reply. Timothy heard the creak of new leather as a pair of heavy boots walked towards the kitchen across the wooden floor in the hall. Mrs. King was too upset to have heard anything. Timothy saw the long black shadow as it passed the light outside the cellar door. This is no time for jokes," shouted Mr. King, rising from his chair nervously. "I was in the army, you know, trained to kill and all that." Timothy saw the door handle twist violently just as Mr. King pulled the door open. There was nobody there. Mr. King went into the hall to investigate and took Mrs. King with him just in case there was any trouble. Timothy was left alone at the kitchen table. A paper napkin fell off the edge of the table as if somebody had just brushed past it, and Timothy thought that he could smell flour. No, he was sure he could smell flour and baking, the sort of smell you get when you go out for a pizza. Oh, he hated pizza. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. There was a hand over his mouth, and the hairs on the back of his neck were standing on end. Something was scratching his cheek. No, not something. Lots of things, like long fingernails, only they weren't as thick as fingernails. They were more like sticks or pins or... spaghetti. Spaghetti! That was the smell. Then his parents came back into the room, and the smell went away. Much to his mother's surprise, Timothy ate everything that was put in front of him for the next few days. "Do you know what I think?" said his mother one day. "What?" said Timothy, tucking into his second yoghurt. "I think we had a visit from the spaghetti man on Sunday." "Who?" said Timothy, reaching for a pear. "The spaghetti man. He takes bad little children who won't eat their food to his factory in Italy, where he turns them into spaghetti." "Have I never told you about him before?" "Well, he didn't take me off to Italy, did he?" "Well, he's probably giving you a second chance," said Mrs. King. "If you eat all your food from now on, he'll never come back." Now, most children would have listened to what their mothers said. The threat of another visit from the spaghetti man would be enough to make them eat even sprouts or cold rice pudding or marmalade without a word of complaint. Timothy, however, was a rare breed. Whatever his mother asked him to do, he'd always do the opposite. The very next morning, things were back to normal. "I want to go to the loo." "Not in the middle of breakfast, Timothy." "I'm not having breakfast," said Timothy. "Yes, you are," said his mother. "No, I'm not, because this isn't breakfast. This is a cow pat," smirked Timothy, and he left the table without asking to get down. Mr. King was too busy reading his newspaper to notice. Mrs. King had had enough. She rushed out of the kitchen and grabbed Timothy by the back of his shirt. Then she frog-marched him back to the table, picked him up, plonked him down and told him that he could sit there all day for all she cared, until he had finished his toast. Timothy did sit there all day. In fact, he sat there all the next day as well. He tried hiding his toast in the dustbin and pretending that he'd eaten it, but his mother got it out again and put it back on his plate. He tried feeding his toast to his goldfish, but they didn't like it. He even tried slipping it into the postman's sack when he delivered the letters, but the postman found it one street later and posted it back through Timothy's letterbox. In fact, he tried everything to get rid of his toast, except eating it. On the morning of the third day, Mr. King went off to work as usual, and Mrs. King went out for a walk. Normally she would have taken Timothy, but he still hadn't eaten his toast. This meant that Timothy was alone in the house, and he was furious. He went to the fridge and took out everything inside. He put it all in a black plastic bin liner and shoved it down the bottom of his mother's bed. Then he kicked the cat. He found a large blue screwdriver that belonged to his father and scratched his name across the sitting room door. He filled his pockets with stones from the garden and went around the house smashing light bulbs with them. He was up in the bathroom, putting the plug in the bath and turning on the taps, when he heard the latch click on the front door. Good. His mother was back and she'd be livid. He'd teach her to make him eat his toast. As the water rose in the bath, he could hear the squeak of his mother's new leather boots as she walked across the wooden floor in the hall and climbed the stairs. As he turned the taps up to full power, he saw his mother's shadow creep under the door. He laughed triumphantly as the first drop of water splashed over the edge and the door handle to the bathroom twisted violently. The door was flung open. "See, I'm never eating toast again!" shouted Timothy. But he was shouting to himself, because there was nobody there, just that smell again of flour and baking and spaghetti. When Mrs. King got home a couple of minutes later, the water was rushing down the stairs. She shouted for Timothy, but there was no reply. Timothy awoke to find himself in a room full of children. All of them had grumpy-looking faces, a bit like Timothy's. He wondered where on earth he was. He looked out of the window, but there was nothing to see except a disused yard and 2 blue gates. Over in the corner, a green tarpaulin had been thrown over a van, which Timothy could see was black. "Where are we?" said Timothy to a girl with bright red curly hair. "Have you never heard of the Spaghetti Man?" she said. "What, that Italian geezer who turns children into pasta when they don't eat their food?" "That's right," she said. "But he's not real," said Timothy. "Oh, isn't he?" replied the curly-haired girl. "Then what's this?" She showed Timothy a label on her coat. It read, "Curly Twirls." "Well, what are curly twirls?" said Timothy. "But they're those things you have with tomato sauce. That's what he's going to turn me into." "You're fibbing me," said Timothy. "Well, have a look at your own label if you don't believe me," said the girl, and she wandered off. Timothy's label was stitched onto his BMX sweatshirt. He read it upside down. "Lasagna? Oh, yuck," thought Timothy. "Lasagna? Absolutely my all-time worst food. Disgusting. Fancy being turned into lasagna when I don't even like it." He went around the room looking at everybody else's labels. Tall, thin children were marked up as spaghetti. The fat ones had macaroni written all over them. And the little kids were labelled as fasta pasta. Timothy chuckled. He leapt onto a table. "Listen, everybody," he shouted. "Stop looking so miserable. This is a joke. We're not going to be turned into pasta. The Spaghetti Man is just a story that our mums and dads made up to make us eat our food. I don't know about you, but I've had enough. I'm going home." He turned to the door, but a pair of new leather boots blocked his way. A man wearing a baker's apron and a chef's hat stood dusting the flour off his hands. "Guess who I'm having for dinner tonight?" laughed the Spaghetti Man. It was a cruel laugh that made the children suddenly wish they weren't there. But of course, they were. That night, as Venice slept peacefully, the great silver pasta machines ground into action. In the morning, a gleaming black van pulled away from the old pasta factory, and the blue gates were bolted for another year. Mr. and Mrs. King never saw their son Timothy again. Mrs. King was rather pleased, although she never admitted it. He had been quite obnoxious, the worst behaved boy she'd ever known. Mr. King hadn't noticed that Timothy was missing, so Mrs. King never told him. Their lives went on pretty much as normal. Mr. King would go off to work, and Mrs. King would stay at home and prepare his evening meal. Tonight, it's lasagna.